Good morning. Welcome to another episode of Weekday Wisdom. I'm looking forward to beginning a brand new series with you today. And today we're going to start a series that I've entitled Exiled. And we're examining the life of Daniel. Daniel and thousands of other Jews had been displaced from the land that God had given to them. They were exiled in a land of Babylon. The entire story of Daniel's life, stories that you probably are familiar with, Daniel in the lion's den. The entire story of Daniel's life takes place in this context of a man of God who had been removed from the nation, the land, the culture that God had intended for him to live in. And yet, in spite of this context, we find Daniel's life to be a story of courage, a story of faith, of faithfulness, a life of purpose, a man who was greatly used of God in spite of the circumstances he was given. I'm reminded that those things that were written aforetime, like the story of Daniel, were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scripture might have hope. Yes, indeed, we can take application from the life of Daniel. Now, I'm looking forward to the journey. Today, we're primarily going to focus on the background to the story of Daniel. We'll read here just a few verses, make a few comments on it, and that will set the stage for us to come back tomorrow and begin examining the life of Daniel. The Bible tells us in Daniel chapter 1 and verse number 1, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. Verse number 6 says this, among these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We'll later learn that Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, we know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But we find that Daniel is among this group. So what is the background? What is the time period? What is happening here in the nation of Israel? You'll recall that Israel was a divided kingdom. The northern kingdom, the 10 tribes of Israel, and the southern kingdom of Judah. God had already pronounced his judgment, and that judgment on the northern kingdom had already taken place nearly 120 years previous to the time of this story. The nation, the kingdom of Assyria, had rooted out the northern kingdom of Israel. But God's hand of mercy had been on the southern kingdom of Judah. There were glimpses of times in Judah's history when they turned back to God and stopped following the ways of the people that were there in the land that they had inhabited and followed wholly after God. One of those kings that led in that revival was King Hezekiah, and perhaps you remember the stories of his day. Another was King Josiah. King Josiah, in fact, is the father of the king who we're speaking of here in Daniel chapter 1, Jehoiakim. King Josiah had sought hard to follow the Lord in all of his ways. The Bible tells us that of King Josiah that there was like unto him no king before him that turned to the Lord with all his heart, with all his soul, with all his might, according to the law of Moses. But it was too late for Judah because of Josiah's grandfather, King Manasseh. King Manasseh's great wickedness and the wickedness that he led the southern kingdom of Judah into. Because of that, God had already determined the trouble that would come upon Judah. And indeed, it was trouble. God said that he would remove Judah out of his sight, that he would cast off the city of Jerusalem, and this would begin to play out in the days of King Jehoiakim. We find here in this story one of the deportations. There were 3 deportations of the southern kingdom of Judah under the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Now, Babylon had just recently risen to its worldwide prominence. The nation of the kingdom of Assyria and Egypt to some extent up until about 609, 6 to 605 BC, they had really been the world leaders at the time. But when Babylon defeated a coalition of the nation of Assyria and of Egypt, Babylon rose to great power. And in doing so, they came into the land of Israel and to Jerusalem and besieged the city of Jerusalem and began a series of deportations, taking people out of the kingdom of Judah and placing them into Babylon, a place of false gods, a place of idol worship, a place that did not recognize Jehovah as the one true God. This is the context of the life of Daniel. He's one of these that are spoken of in verse number 3, one of these certain children of Israel, one of the king's seed, one who was perhaps a prince. He's one who is well favored. He was skillful in wisdom, cunning in knowledge. He understood science. And it was these young men that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, took out of Jerusalem into the southern kingdom of Judah and placed into Babylon in order to be, might we say, brainwashed, in order to be entrenched in the culture and in the ways of Babylon. And this is the context whereby we find faithful Daniel. You know, we're not going to go any farther than this today as we're just seeking to lay the groundwork. But I want to remind us, Christian, that in the life of Daniel, we can take great courage. We can take great hope. I know that we as Christians, we live in the context of a culture, the context of a society that so oftentimes seems to have turned wholly away from the God that we desire to love and to serve with our lives. Sometimes we think that that's an impossible task. We sometimes believe that it's impossible for us as Christians in the context of the culture that we live in to live a victorious, to live a faithful, to live a loving God and serving God life. But what we find in the story of Daniel is that that is absolutely possible, and it's possible with God. I'm looking forward to taking this journey with you. I trust that you'll plan on following me with it. Remember, if you get behind, these are short devotionals. You can go back and you can pick up and catch up with where we are. And also remember, if these are an encouragement to you, a blessing to you, won't you please share them with others? Looking forward tomorrow to examining lesson number 1 from the life of exile in Babylon. God bless you. Have a fantastic day.